So, as I mentioned earlier, this month we're starting a new series of lessons that's called The Gospel According to. And each week we'll have a different man from our men's ministry is going to come and deliver the lesson. And each week they are going to kind of illuminate from an Old Testament Bible person and kind of look at their life and their story and show the good news of Jesus Christ, how we get the good news from them or their version of it. So our first speaker is going to be Brad Jones. Brad, you want to come up? Brad, I asked Brad to send me a couple of lines of introduction, and he feels like he's best known as either being Carter and Cammie's dad, or Corey's husband, or Mark and Carol's son. And so,
Kurt and Roxy's son-in-law.
Yeah, and Kurt.
I did say that.
Kind of claim fame there being that because we're our first preacher and first lady here at Grace Chapel. And so, but we know that, I mean, obviously Brad's relational ties are really important, and we love your whole family. But also, just the couple of years that I've been here, I've known Brad to have a great reputation as being an excellent communicator in general, but also an excellent communicator of God's words. We're blessed to have him here. And also, if you are a man, and if you ever see advertisements or kind of for our men's breakfasts, I will have to say, growing up and through my church history, I've been to a lot of different men's breakfasts. And typically speaking, they've been boring. They've just... It's not the most exciting thing for me. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, men's breakfast. But since I have been at Grace Chapel, and much to Brad's leadership, and I know that there's a team of guys that work on that, so I won't give him all the credit, but it's a lot of Brad's leadership, and he is the face of the men's breakfast, and they are by far the best men's breakfast, I'm going to say, that you could go to at any church. So if you have not been participating in them, you should do that. Now I'm going to be quiet and get off the stage, and let's listen to Brad.
Thank you. All right, everyone. So, a few thousand years ago, there was a boy born in Bethlehem. His earthly father, Jesse, was a poor man who came from a humble family. And it didn't matter, because this boy was ordained to be king. He was filled with the Holy Spirit, and he went on to do amazing things we're going to talk about them today. And as you all know, I'm talking about David. But boy, that sounds like someone else, doesn't it? And the parallels between David and Jesus' life are remarkable, and we'll dig into that today as we talk about the gospel according to David. But before we do, I think it's good to level set on how maybe like a definition I have for the word gospel. The gospel is a lot of things. As Rob said, we've been talking about gospel for several months here, and you can, fill a lot of sermons, a lot of classes about, but I like to oversimplify things. Maybe it's just because I'm a simple person, I don't know. But in the case of the gospel, I like to define it like this, and it'll be good for context for the rest of this sermon. The gospel is good news about a new kingdom marked by restored relationships. The gospel is good news about a new kingdom marked by restored relationships. All right, now let's look at David and see what we can learn about the gospel. Now, when we think of David, we usually think of all the good things, right, that happened in his life. He was anointed king as an early, as a young man. He was protected from Saul, who was the standing king at the time. He defeated Goliath with a slingshot and, a river stone. We know that Saul eventually died, not at David's hand, in battle, and David became king of Judah. He won some battles against Saul's relatives and became king of Israel, uniting Israel together. He takes back Jerusalem, brings the ark there, and wins a lot more battles. And in all of this, God gives him this covenant promise. So just like the cherry on top. And in 2 Samuel 7, verse 8, it says, "Now go to my servant David and say, 'This is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I took you from tending sheep in the pasture and selected you to be the leader of my people, Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone. I have destroyed all your enemies before your eyes. Now I will make your name as famous as anyone who's ever lived on earth. And God goes on to tell David that through his family line, he will establish an eternal throne. An eternal throne. And we look at that and we say, wow. I mean, David lived a pretty remarkable life. God rewarded his faithfulness with epic victories, great fame, an eternal throne, and it's pretty amazing. But then we look at the Psalms. You know, David wrote most of the Psalms, and there are a lot of Psalms about the love and the power and the holiness of God. But there's just as many, maybe more, about David's despair, where he questions God's loyalty, he questions God's presence, he questions God's provision. And you ask yourself, how could the same person write two distinct type of psalms with so much emotion and passion? And ultimately, it's a mark or a symptom of the brokenness in the earthly kingdom. But the gospel is good news about a new kingdom marked by restored relationships. And David's family line is not only going to usher this gospel in, this good news in, through Jesus later, but David's family line actually shows us why we need the gospel. And we don't need to look any further than his son Absalom. So Absalom was born around the time David was fighting Saul's relatives to reunite Israel. And Absalom had some pretty serious sin in his life, the kind of sin that we can't talk about this morning because the kids are in here. Like, it was not good. And that sin ultimately led him to kill his older brother Amnon. After killing him, he fled Jerusalem, and he was gone for quite some time. And of course, King David, had to be totally distraught, right? One of his sons killed another son, the sin that surrounded all of that. But over time, David forgave Absalom, and he kind of wanted to be reunited with his son. So he sent away for Absalom. Absalom comes back, and there's this period of time where they're both in Jerusalem, and they don't see each other, but eventually they do. They get together, they're reunited, they're reconciled. Or so you think. Because the very next verse, like literally the next verse after it says David was reconciled to Absalom, you see, well, I'm going to read here from 2 Samuel 15. I'm going to read some verses between 1 and 14, and then we'll pick up in verse 30. But it says, after this, Absalom brought a chariot and horses and hired 50 bodyguards to run ahead of him. Why would he do that? Why would he buy a chariot and horses and 50 bodyguards? What's he up to? And then you see his scheme starts in the next verse. He got up early every morning and went out to the gate of the city. When the people brought their case to the king for judgment, Absalom would ask where in Israel they were from, and they would tell him his tribe. Then Absalom would say, "You've got a strong case here. It's too bad the king doesn't have anyone to hear it. I wish I were the judge. Then everyone could bring their cases to me for judgment, and I would give them justice." And when the people would bow before him, Absalom wouldn't let them. Instead, he took him by the hand and kissed him. And Absalom did this to everyone who came to the king for judgment. So he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. And it said 4 years later, now during this 4 years, he might have been doing the same thing, but 4 years go by, and Absalom goes to David and said, "Hey, David, Dad, I need to go to Hebron. I promised God I would make the sacrifice in Hebron, so will you let me go?" And King David says, "Yeah, go ahead." And we pick up in verse 10, and this is Absalom now in Hebron. He says, while he was still there, he sent secret messengers to all the tribes of Israel to stir up a rebellion against the king, his dad. "As soon as you hear the ram's horn," his message read, "you are to say, Absalom has been crowned king of Hebron." So we now know why he's going to Hebron, to set up base camp. He took 200 men from Jerusalem with him as guests. They knew nothing of his intentions. He involuntarily brought an army with him. While Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel, one of David's counselors who lived in Gilo. Soon many others also joined Absalom, and the conspiracy gained momentum. In verse 13 it says, a messenger arrived to David in Jerusalem and said, all of Israel has joined Absalom in a conspiracy against you. We must flee at once, or it'll be too late, David urged his men. Hurry. If we get out of the city before Absalom arrives, both we and Jerusalem will be spared from disaster. And then we get to this verse right here, 2 Samuel 15, verse 30. David walked up the road to the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and his feet were bare as a sign of mourning. And the people who were with him covered their heads and wept as they climbed the hill. I mean, can you imagine the betrayal that David must have felt? He had to be heartbroken that not only his advisor, but his son had turned against him. And it's possible with this situation in mind, he wrote Psalms 41, where it says, O Lord, I prayed, have mercy on me, heal me, for I've sinned against you. But my enemies say nothing but evil about me. How soon will he die and be forgotten, they ask. They visit me as if they were my friends, but all the while they gather gossip, and when they leave, they just spread it everywhere. All who hate me whisper about me, imagining the worst. He has some fatal disease, they say. He'll never get out of bed. But listen. Even my best friend, the one I trusted completely, the one who shared my food, has turned against me. How many of you have felt betrayal from someone close to you? Maybe they were jealous. Maybe they viewed you as some sort of threat. Maybe you were just in the way of their success. But you can relate to this phrase, even my best friend, the one I trusted completely, the one who I shared a meal with, has turned against me. You know who else felt betrayal? In John 13, Jesus says these words, I'm not saying these things to all of you. I know the ones I have chosen. But this fulfills the scripture that says, the one who eats my food has turned against me. I tell you this beforehand, so that when it happens, you'll believe I'm the Messiah. I tell you the truth, anyone who welcomes my messenger is welcoming me, and anyone who welcomes me is welcoming the Father who sent me. And then we see the emotion of Jesus. He was deeply troubled, and he exclaimed, I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me. Jesus knew the Psalms. I think he chose these words very specifically because maybe for the first time in his life he could relate to the experiences and emotions that David had when he wrote them the first time. As he's sitting there around the table with his closest followers, the ones he's poured into, one of them is going to lead him to death. Betrayal. And then just a few chapters later, Jesus is talking to a larger group this time, and he's mourning the brokenness of the world. He talks about the hate that's been following him everywhere since the beginning of his ministry. And now it's about to result in his death. And you see just a few chapters later again in John 15, starting in verse 18. If the world hates you, remember, it hated me first. The world would love you as one of its own if you belong to it, but you are no longer part of the world. I chose you to come out of the world, so it hates you. That's that new kingdom. Anyone who hates me also hates my Father. If I hadn't done such miraculous signs among them that no one else could do, they would be guilty. But as it is, they've seen everything I did, and they still hate me and my Father. This fulfills what is written in the Scriptures. They hate me without cause. Again, Jesus knew the Psalms. Like he's nearing the end of his ministry here. He's looking at people who have followed him for weeks, maybe months, maybe years, on dirt roads, on foot, all over Israel, through good times and bad times, times of celebration, times of hunger. And he's looking at them, and he's thinking about the hate that he has felt since the beginning. And that when he's gone, there's not going to be a buffer between him and those people. And that hate is going to shift to them, to us. And he's probably sitting there thinking, praying, do they have what it takes? Can they handle it? Please, God, will you let them take it? Will you let them handle it? He's overcome with emotion. Maybe in the same way that David was when he wrote the psalm that Jesus quoted right here. They hated me without cause. Listen to the emotion in David's psalm as that Jesus just quoted. Save me, O God, for the floodwaters are up to my neck. Deeper and deeper I sink into the mire. I can't find a foothold. I am in deep water. The floods overwhelm me. I am exhausted from crying for help. My throat is parched. My eyes are swollen with weeping, waiting for my God to help me. Those who hate me without cause outnumber the hairs on my head. Many enemies try to destroy me with lies, demanding that I give back what I did not steal. You see how Jesus reflects David's pain and that's revealed in the psalm. Real pain. I mean, look at the words he used. These floodwaters are up to his neck. He's in this mire. These floods are overwhelming him. He is at a breaking point. David's at a breaking point. He can't take much more. It's maybe as if he's recalling a situation in his life where he's had to flee his hometown because his son and advisor were following him. And it seems to David, everywhere he went, like Jesus, suffering was following him. In one case, that suffering was called Shimei. In 2 Samuel 16, this is as David and his men are fleeing Jerusalem. It says, David came to Baram, and a man came out of the village cursing them. It was Shimei, son of Gera, who was from the same clan as Saul's family. He threw stones at the king and the king's officers and all the mighty warriors who surrounded him. Get out of here, you murderer, you scoundrel, he shouted to David. The Lord is paying you back for all the bloodshed in Saul's clan. You stole his throne, and now the Lord is giving it to your son Absalom. At last you will taste some of your own medicine, for you are a murderer. And then David said to Abishai and all the servants, my own son is trying to kill me. Doesn't this relative of Saul have even more reason to do so? Leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to do it. And perhaps the Lord will see that I am being wronged and will bless me because of these curses today. So David and his men continued down the road, and Shimei kept pace in a nearby hillside, cursing and throwing stones and dirt at David. And the king and all who were with him grew weary along the way. So they rested when they reached the Jordan River. It's like it doesn't stop. The hits just keep coming for David. I mean, just when you think things are like, he just wants to walk away, get out of Jerusalem, and he can't do that in peace. The suffering is following him. And unfortunately, for David, it doesn't get any better. Because just a few chapters later in 2 Samuel 18, David's men are set to battle Absalom, his son. And David wants to actually go into the battle, but the men say, no, you need to stay here. And because of that, David said, that's fine, but deal with my son Absalom gently. So that message goes throughout the men, and they go into battle. It turns out to be a very bloody battle. 20,000 people die. During the battle, Absalom is riding on a mule, and he comes across some of David's men. Now, little side note. Earlier in 2 Samuel, we learned that Absalom is the most beautiful man in all of Israel. He was on the front of the magazine. And it's because he had this luscious hair. He had this beautiful hair that he would only cut once a year, and that's because it was too heavy. And when they cut it, it weighed 5 pounds. But the hair got the best of him, because he's on a mule, he sees some of David's men, he turns to flee, and as he's fleeing, that hair gets caught in a thick tree, and the mule keeps going, and he's left there hanging, alive. So David's men see this, and a lot of them are like, don't touch him. Remember what David said, leave him alone. We got to deal gently with Absalom. But Joab came up and said, I'll take care of it. You see, Joab and Absalom had some history. And Joab and his men, they killed Absalom. Then Ahimaaz and an Ethiopian raced to tell David the news. Now, in all credit to the Ethiopian, he didn't know it was a race. He was just sent to tell David the news. Ahimaaz came later and said, let me go, let me tell David the news. And Joab was like, fine, go. Well, Ahimaaz ends up beating the Ethiopian because he takes, as it says here, the less demanding route. So why is Ahimaaz doing that? Like, why is he trying to get there first? Well, let's pick it up here in 2 Samuel 18, verse 29. This is when Ahimaaz gets to King David. What about young Absalom, the king demanded. Is he all right? Ahimaaz replied, When Joab told me to come, there was a lot of commotion, and I didn't know what was happening. Rewrite history. That's why Ahimaaz wanted to get there. David was wise to it. Wait here, the king told him. So Ahimaaz stepped aside. Then the man from Ethiopia arrived and said, I have good news for the Lord my king. Today the Lord has rescued you from all those who rebelled against you. What about young Absalom, the king demanded. Is he all right? And the Ethiopian replied, May all of your enemies, my lord and king, both now and in the future, share the fate of that young man. And the king was overcome with emotion. He went to the room over the gateway and burst into tears. As he went, he cried, Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. Reconciliation that led to betrayal, that led to hate, and now death. David is probably at one of the lowest points of his life. And it could just be these events that inspired him to write Psalms 22. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far away when I groan for help? Every day I call you, my God, but you do not answer. Every night I lift my voice, but I find no relief. And as we all know, Jesus echoes these words on the cross as he fully experienced the brokenness of the earthly kingdom. At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. At about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you abandoned me? These stories show us that relationships in the earthly kingdom are broken. They're broken. I mean, just look at the last couple days of Jesus' life. He comes into Jerusalem, the triumphant entry. He's on a donkey and everybody's worshiping him, and then just hours later, the same people in the same town are convicting him, condemning him to death on the cross. Also in his last days, he's with his closest group of men, the ones who have been with him the longest, the ones who he's invested in the most. They betray him. They deny him. They abandon him. It all points to one destructive ingredient that we see in our earthly relationships, and that's selfishness. Selfishness leads to separation. It's this measuring stick we put out between us and the people around us. We're constantly assessing, how do I stack up professionally, materially, emotionally? We got our measuring sticks out and we're constantly assessing, is what I'm putting into the relationship being returned? Am I getting enough out of it? We put the measuring stick up around us and wonder, is this person making my life better? But the gospel is good news about a new kingdom marked by restored relationships. And see, while the relationships in the earthly kingdom are broken due to selfishness, relationships in the heavenly kingdom, where God is on the throne, not us, are restored because the measuring stick is thrown out the window, and the new foundation is now love, not selfishness. You see, the new kingdom says, the least shall be the greatest. Serve rather than be served. Turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. Forgive those who harm you. And it takes selfishness and it turns it on its head. It says, love others the way you love yourself. Jesus not only showed us what the new kingdom looked like when he came, put on flesh, and walked among us, he also opened the door for us to enter this new heavenly kingdom because he reconciled us to God. He reconciled us to God. And it's only, just like Jesus, our relationships with each other can only be restored if our relationship with God is restored. Because it's in the presence of God that the selfishness that leads to the broken earthly kingdom vanishes and is replaced by the love of God. In God's presence, selfishness can't exist. So the closer we are to God, the more it goes away and the more his love is rooted in us. That's how relationships in the heavenly kingdom are restored. But notice I'm not saying the gospel is good news about a new kingdom where all earthly pain and suffering disappear. We know that not to be true. We just read about Jesus, and he dealt with a lot of pain and suffering. But the good news is in the heavenly kingdom, that pain and suffering can be redeemed. And I think this, folks, this is the lesson that we learn from David about the gospel. This, that in all the pain and suffering he went through, the lowest of the lows that he felt, at times even blaming God for what happened, he could still write the beautiful Psalms. You see, his relationship with God allowed him to rise above the brokenness of the world. We see this vividly in a psalm that David wrote at the end of his life that's actually not in the Psalms. It's in 2 Samuel 22. Listen to the imagery of this psalm. He reached down from on high and took hold of me and drew me out of the deep waters. Remember those deep waters we were talking about before? He drew me out of the deep waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes who were too strong for me. They confronted me in my day of disaster. We read a lot about some pretty disastrous days. But the Lord was my support. Here's what I want to key in on as we wrap up. He brought me out into a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. He brought me out into a spacious place. So a couple years ago, I got into hiking. A friend of mine, who's actually my first boss and mentor, now a good friend, was a hiker, and he said, you ought to come join us, because I was talking about walking all the time, and he said, you ought to come join us. And so I did. I joined him on a couple hikes. Our first hike was the Georgia section of the Appalachian Trail. I mean, these are legit hikes. Like, we're putting on the packs, and I'm cooking my own food and, making my bed and all this stuff. And the guys that I'm with, so one of them, like I said, was my first boss and mentor. He's a little bit older. He had a friend who was about his same age, and then there was one other guy who was about my age, but maybe not in as good a shape. Not that I'm in great shape, but I did a lot of walking, so like I could hike. So what happens on these hikes when I go with them is I tend to get out a little bit ahead of everybody. Like the first hike we did in the Appalachian Trail, there were times I got so far out ahead, I took a nap accidentally, fell asleep. They came up, woke me up, and it was just like, hey, let's keep going. Well, the second hike we did was Grand Tetons, backcountry of Grand Tetons. Now, what they tell you when you're hiking is you really ought to stay with your crew. You shouldn't drift off because there's like some big animals out there. Appalachian Trail, it doesn't matter. There's people everywhere. Like, you see people all the time. Grand Tetons, there's only 100 passes for the backcountry in the Grand Tetons per night. There were days we were doing that hike, I saw 4 people the whole day. So I remember the beginning of this hike. It's my first big hike. It's the first time where it's like, out west and everything. And I stay with, we take this gondola up to the top of one of the mountains, and we come down the back range, and I'm staying with these guys, and they're going slow. It's driving me crazy. And I mean, I'm telling them about it. Like, guys, come on, like, let's go. Let's get some pep in our step, And we get to the end of the first day, and there's, probably about 1.5 miles left, and they go, Brad, you know what, dude? Go ahead. You got 1.5 miles, go to the campsite, pick the best one, and, start setting up. And so I was like, great. So I start trucking, right? Well, where we were camping was down in this valley. There was a beautiful little pond down there and some running water. And so because of that, there was a lot more trees and grass and growth. And when you're going down into a valley, you kind of, go back and forth like this. You're cutting back. And I remember kind of starting to go down and making a few cuts and running around. I was like, I can't really see around the corner here, And then I came to this spot where there was this tall grass and there was a huge indentation in it. There was no animal. I could see that. But there was an animal, and it was big. And from that point on, I was literally banging every tree, hey bear, around every corner, like you're supposed to do, just make a bunch of noise. It got me. It shook me. So I got to the camp, told them everybody's story. They made fun of me all night. We ate dinner with a ram. It was beautiful. Next morning we get up, and the way the trail goes is you're immediately up out of the valley, and it's really steep, and it's pretty long. Just right out of the gate. Legs aren't ready to go. You're on it. And, when I start going up a hill, I don't want to stop, because if I stop, I don't know if I'm going to get going again. So I just start trucking. I put it in low gear. I start going up. I get to the top of the hill, look back. These dudes they're not even a third of the way up. I mean, they're just like, I don't even know what they're doing back there. But I turn around from the valley, and I see where we're going, and it's this vast meadow at elevation, with mountain ranges all the way around, and the 3 primary Teton peaks straight ahead. That's where we're going. And it is a beautiful day. And you just see this, in this meadow, this one little foot trail, and that's what we're doing. So I start down that foot trail, and it is amazing. It's surreal. I go probably about a half mile, turn around. I don't even see the guys. I mean, they're still probably halfway down the hill. So I take off my pack, and I sit down, and I just surrender to the beauty that's around me. Spacious places, the things David's talking about, are safe. And they clear your head, and they let you enjoy the journey. When your relationship with God is restored, you are brought into his kingdom, which is a spacious place. It gives us a new perspective, and it allows us to experience his saving grace and enjoy the journey no matter what it throws at us. That, my friends, is really, really good news.